Hi everybody, welcome back to another Thursday Tips and Tricks. As you can guess, we're going to be talking about fabric today, and we're also going to be discussing grain lines, and we're going to be talking about the positives and the negatives and the strengths and the weaknesses of making cuts on different grain lines to help you build better quilts. Let's start first with some of the terminology that you're going to hear. Basically, our fabric is woven. It's woven with threads running north and south and threads running east and west, and they're perpendicular to each other. And there are terms that you're going to hear always when you're discussing fabric. One of the terms is salvage. Lengthwise grain, crosswise grain, and bias. Now, what do each of those terms mean? Let's start at the beginning with salvages. Salvages are actually self edges. That's what they mean. And it can also be spelled salvage like you see on the other side over there. But they are finished edges that run the entire length of every piece of fabric that you buy. They are made from very tightly woven threads. They frequently have information on them. And that information may include the fabric designer, it might include the manufacturer of the fabric itself, it may include a date or a year, which is very helpful when you're going to buy more fabric because you ran out. But also, oftentimes the salvages have color bullets on them. And those are very helpful when you are coordinating fabrics for a quilt. But one of the things you should remember is you should never use the salvages either in your piecework or in your backings. There's no stretch along that edge. And if you actually hear the term usable with the fabric, what that means is the measured width of your fabric minus the salvages. They're not included in usable width. So that's a little bit about the term salvages. Now, lengthwise grain. Lengthwise grain are the threads that run parallel to the salvages, and they are indeed the strongest part of your quilt. I can't even stretch the lengthwise grain, those are the ones that are running parallel, of a piece of fabric along. I can't stretch the lengthwise grain. It's the strongest part of your fabric. Going across from salvage to salvage, you have crosswise grains. And when you tug on crosswise grains, you're going to find that there's a little bit of stretch, but not much. It's just about as strong as the lengthwise, but has just a little bit of give to it. And then you have any cut that's made in between the crosswise grain and the lengthwise grain. If the cut is made at a true 45-degree angle, that's what's called true bias. And that true bias, this thing right here, has the most amount of stretch of any part of your fabric. But occasionally, you're going to see that there's a term that I call a pattern bias, where if you look at the true bias, it doesn't follow the pattern of the triangles, but maybe for one purpose or another, I want to follow the edge of the triangles. And you can see that when I swing this over and just follow this down and put it there, that is also a bias. It has lots of stretch, just like the true bias, but it isn't one that's made at 45 degrees. It's made following the triangle pattern on the fabric. Now, why should I consider grain line when I'm piecing? Well, we talked a little bit about the strengths of and weaknesses of the different cuts that you make, but there's some general guidelines that you should follow when you're doing piecework and dealing with the cuts on your grain line. The first one is, whenever you create a block, you should try to create a block, a unit, a quilt, so that all of the outside edges are on the straight of the grain. And for small pieces, like a block like this, the lengthwise grain, the strongest one, and the crosswise grain are pretty much interchangeable. There's not much difference in those at all. And those triangles are created by cutting a square in half and placing those up there and piecing those units together. Some of the other benefits of the lengthwise grain. I would use the lengthwise grain anytime I'm cutting my borders. If I have the opportunity, I do that because it's going to stabilize the edges of my quilt. I would use the lengthwise grain cuts if I'm cutting sashing pieces. Okay, it's going to give me a good strong framework for putting my blocks together. You can use, and it might happen because you want a specific effect, you can use the crosswise grain. It just has a little bit more stretch. But if it doesn't matter, with a pattern on the fabric, if you're using this, cut your sashing strips and your borders lengthwise if you have the opportunity. Crosswise grain, again, I can pretty much use that for here. Oh, I know, one other time, I would use lengthwise grain when I'm cutting and producing backing, especially for a quilt that's going to be hung on the wall. You want the lengthwise grain placed on the backing of your quilt so that it runs the way that the quilt's going to hang, and then it's going to hang even, and you're not going to have any distortion. What you want to try to avoid is bias. Now, a lot of people say, well, why does anybody even want bias? Well, if you're an applique artist, you want bias because that's what gives you the ability to make curves smooth and curved stems. Piping is always made with bias strips. Personally, when I bind a quilt, bias is what I like to use, and we'll talk about that in another Thursday tips and tricks. But bias is part of our construction process, and it's okay, and you have to deal with it, so you have to be careful with it. You have to pay attention to where it's located, and that's, I guess, what my point is. When I make half square triangles, like in a block like this, the bias is contained on the inside of the unit, but the unit itself has straight of grain on all the edges. What you want to avoid is having a fabric like this, that's cut like that, placed when you're making a half square triangle, because notice what you have. You have bias edges on the outside edge of your block. And if I replaced all of these and put all of these out here to create that unit, I have real potential for a problem going down the road. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that next week when I talk about making half square triangles and the good and the bad and the ugly. But I guess my point is, have a good, healthy respect for bias where it falls in your project, and know that if you use the Studio 180 design tools, we do have that respect for bias. When I'm making my shapes, now there's a bias edge being sewn to a straight edge inside here, but the edge of the unit, when I replaced it with the grain line, you can see the edge of every unit is on the straight of the grain. And that happens with all the units that we make. These are units from the square squared. These are units that I made with the V block. And yes, there are bias seams, and yes, you're going to have to sew carefully, not be pulling and yanking when you're putting it under your needle, not be stretching it when you're doing heavy duty ironing, but the edge of every unit will be on the straight of the grain, giving you strength and stability to your blocks, to your units, to your blocks, and to your quilts. So I hope you join me next week when I talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly of making these half square triangles. And if there's time, I'm going to share with you a great little pattern that I've tuckerized to eliminate some of the bias issues that you're going to see when you see it elsewhere. All right, everybody take care. I'll see you next week.